Imagine being 14 years old. You're in the 8th grade, dreaming of the future, perhaps about becoming an artist or flying airplanes. Now, imagine being accused of a horrific crime, tried without proper defense, and executed, all within 83 days. This was the tragic fate of George Stinney Jr., the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. In 1944, in the small, segregated town of Alcolu, South Carolina, George lived in a divided world. A railroad track physically and metaphorically split the black and white communities. On one side of the tracks, George, his parents, and his siblings lived in a humble home. On the other side, white families lived their lives largely disconnected and shielded from the daily struggles of the black population. But on March 23rd, that fragile separation shattered. Two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were riding their bicycles through the black neighborhood looking for maypops, wildflowers used to make a kind of natural tea. They spoke briefly to George and his younger sister Amy as they passed by, asking if they'd seen any. That was the last time they were seen alive. The next morning, their battered bodies were discovered in a ditch. Their skulls had been crushed by a railroad spike or a similarly heavy object. The community, fueled by grief and deep-seated racism, demanded swift justice. Within hours, law enforcement turned to George Stinney Jr. No evidence, no witnesses, just the word of a few adults and a rushed judgment. George was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was interrogated alone. No lawyer was present, no parent, no advocate. Just a scared 14-year-old boy surrounded by white officers in a locked room. According to the authorities, George confessed. But that confession was never written, never recorded, never signed. It was simply stated, and that was that. That unverified confession became the cornerstone of a case built on nothing but fear, prejudice, and institutional violence. After George's arrest, his family was forced to flee the town under threats of mob violence. They couldn't visit him. They couldn't speak to him. He was completely isolated, alone in a hostile system designed to break him.
More time
And
to review
break him
legal
it did.
matters discussed in court.
His trial took place
earlier.
on April 24th, 1944, less than a month after the girls were murdered. It lasted just 2 hours. 2 hours to decide the life of a child. An all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes. No black people were allowed to serve on juries in South Carolina at the time, despite making up a large portion of the population. George's court-appointed attorney called no witnesses. He didn't challenge the prosecution's flimsy arguments. He didn't cross-examine anyone. He barely spoke at all. The prosecution's case was riddled with inconsistencies. The timeline didn't add up. The supposed murder weapon was never recovered. There was no physical evidence linking George to the crime scene, but none of that mattered. In the Jim Crow South, the word of a black child carried no weight. George was sentenced to death by electrocution. He was just 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed barely 95 pounds. So small that during his execution, the straps on the electric chair were too big to hold him in place. He was forced to sit on a Bible to reach the proper height. Witnesses reported that the oversized face mask slipped off, revealing his tearful, terrified expression as the electricity surged through his body. June 16th, 1944. That's the day the state of South Carolina executed a child, a scared, innocent boy, the youngest person in modern American history to be sentenced to death and executed by the government. And then, silence. For decades. George's story faded from public memory, buried under layers of shame and denial. But his family never forgot. They knew he was innocent. They remembered where he had been the day the girls were murdered. His sister, Amy, who was with him the whole afternoon, was never allowed to testify. She could have saved his life with just a sentence. George was with me. It wasn't until 70 years later that the wheels of justice began to turn again. In 2014, after persistent efforts by George's surviving family and a team of dedicated attorneys, a South Carolina judge vacated his conviction. The judge acknowledged what should have been obvious in 1944. George had been denied a fair trial. The investigation was rushed, the defense was non-existent, and the entire process was tainted by racial prejudice. This was not just a miscarriage of justice, it was a legal lynching. George Stinney Jr. became more than a name. He became a symbol of the deep flaws in the American justice system, a warning about the dangers of racism, unchecked authority, and a system that values expediency over truth. His case is now taught in law schools and civil rights classes. It has inspired books, documentaries, art installations, and memorials. But let's be honest, no court ruling, no documentary, no public outcry can bring back what was lost. George was a child. He had dreams, curiosity, a family that loved him. And for 83 days he was trapped in a nightmare he could never escape. His execution chair has become a haunting image. A boy sitting on a Bible, eyes wide with fear, surrounded by adults who should have protected him. Instead, they killed him. George's story forces us to ask hard questions. What is justice? Who does it serve? And how many more Georges have there been? Unheard, unprotected, unseen? We live in a time where many believe the past is behind us. But stories like George's remind us that history is not just a series of events, it's a mirror. And sometimes, what it reflects is hard to look at. So we must look. We must remember. We must speak his name, George Stinney Jr., not just to honor him, but to ensure that no child, no matter their race or background, is ever thrown away by the system again. Because if we don't remember, we are doomed to repeat it. George's life was short, but his legacy is long, and now it's up to us to carry it forward. If this story moved you, share it. Let his name be known. Demand better. Demand justice. Because in remembering George, we fight not just for his story, but for all the others still waiting to be heard.